All right, let me talk to you as plainly as I can, the way I would talk to a room full of engineers or public health officials or finance people who all sense that something is wrong with the system but can't quite see where the fault line is. For most of my life, I've lived in the world of systems, software systems, financial systems, health systems, energy systems, education systems. I've seen them under stress. I've seen them fail. I've seen them bend and somehow not break. And there is one lesson you learn over and over again if you pay close attention for long enough. Systems do not collapse because of one headline. They collapse because a series of quiet failures left unaddressed finally become visible. What happened this week, this secret document leak that everyone is suddenly chasing, arguing over, spinning on cable news, is not just another headline. It's not just another Washington scandal, another partisan talking point. What leaked is not just information. It is evidence of something deeper, that the fissure inside the administration's core is widening, and widening fast. Most people are going to focus on the content. What did the document say? Who wrote it? Who leaked it? Who benefits? But that's not how you analyze a system under strain. If you've spent decades dealing with complex architectures, the Windows code base, global vaccine, supply chains, international climate finance, you stop asking just what's in the file, and you start asking something much more important. What does the existence of this file and the fact that it leaked tell us about the integrity of the system that produced it? Because systems that are healthy do not leak like this. Systems that trust themselves do not cannibalize themselves. Systems that believe they can still self-correct don't resort to detonating each other in the press. This is not noise. This is a structural signal. Let me walk you through what this leak actually represents. This was not a press release. This was not a talking point. This was not even a draft policy memo accidentally sent to the wrong recipient. This was a classified internal assessment, a highly restricted, eyes-only analysis of vulnerabilities at the very top of the administration's command structure. Not just policy risks, but governance risks, continuity risks, and what the document itself reportedly calls catastrophic failure pathways. Only a handful of people are supposed to have access to something like that. It doesn't get emailed. It doesn't get printed 100 times. It doesn't sit on a random staffer's laptop. It lives in a controlled environment behind layers of physical and digital security specifically designed to keep it from becoming what it just became, a weapon in a political war. The fact that a document like that left the vault, not metaphorically, but literally means somebody on the inside made a decision that the normal pathways are broken. And that is the real story. In cybersecurity, one of the most chilling phrases you can hear is the perimeter is intact, but the threat was internal. Because once the inside turns against itself, you don't have a firewall problem. You don't have a patch problem. You have a trust problem. That's where we are. Now, I want you to imagine that instead of the White House, we are talking about a mission-critical data center that runs the operations of a global company. Deep in that data center, there is an internal risk assessment, a document that lays out in clinical detail which servers are most fragile, which failover mechanisms are untested, which executives are bottlenecks in crisis, which internal processes might cause a cascading failure, and which red lines would trigger an unrecoverable system crash. Now imagine one of the very few people authorized to read that report decides to walk out with it in hand, it to your biggest competitor. What does that tell you? Yes, your competitor will read it. Yes, your stock will fall. Yes, you'll scramble to do damage control. But underneath all of that, the real message is someone at the absolute core of your system no longer believes in the system's ability to correct itself. They looked at that report, looked at the people around them, looked at the feedback loops, the culture, the incentives, the fear, the denial, and they concluded that the only way to prevent what they saw as disaster was to bypass the very system they are part of. That's not politics. That's not ideology. That is a verdict on the system's integrity. That is what this leak is. From what we know, this document is not a policy wish list. It is not a partisan screed. It is not a stump speech disguised as a memo. It is allegedly a structured, data-backed assessment produced by senior career officials, not campaign operatives, mapping out the internal fractures between agencies, the growing divergence between public messaging and actual operational capacity, the legal risks created by directives that push against constitutional boundaries, the probability that certain orders might be ignored, resisted, or quietly slow-walked by the bureaucracy, and the scenarios under which the chain of command itself could become contested. It's not about whether you agree or disagree politically with the administration. It's about whether the machine that runs the government is still coherent. And what this leak says is some of the people closest to the machine no longer think it is. I've seen different versions of this same failure pattern before in much smaller contexts, but with the same underlying dynamics. Early in the COVID pandemic, there were internal reports inside governments that painted a far darker picture than the public statements. Some of those reports were buried, some were ignored, some leaked. Every time one leaked, it was a sign that the public health system in that place had lost internal coherence. The science said one thing, the politics said another, and the people who had to look at the data every day couldn't live with that gap. In climate policy, we see it when internal assessments warn that emissions targets are impossible given current behavior, but the official plans stay rosy and vague. When those documents leak, it's because someone inside knows the difference between reality and rhetoric has become intolerable. In software, you see it when engineers start quietly circulating postmortems on failures that management won't acknowledge. They copy them, leak them, push them into public issue trackers because they believe that if the truth doesn't surface, the next failure will be worse. When insiders start leaking the truth, it's because they've concluded the system isn't listening. That's where we are now. Let's be very specific about why this is so dangerous. Governments, just like large corporations, rest on three invisible pillars. Internal trust between the people who actually run things day to day. External credibility with citizens, markets, and international partners. Predictability, the sense that even if you dislike a leader, the machinery is stable. What this leak attacks first is internal trust. Think about everyone sitting in those situation room meetings now. Every briefing, every draft, every analytical note, they will all carry the same question. Who in this room is willing to walk out with this and hand it to the world? That question changes behavior immediately. People say less, they write less. They soften their analysis. They avoid worst case scenarios on paper. They move sensitive discussions off the record and off the grid. In other words, the quality of internal information drops at exactly the moment the system most needs. High quality, brutally honest information. You now have decision makers flying blind by choice because they fear their own advisors as much as they fear their opponents. That's the first phase of systemic failure, when leaders stop trusting their own feedback loops. The second pillar this leak shakes is external credibility. Markets don't read political stories the way journalists or voters do. They don't obsess over every adjective. They don't care about the personality drama. They ask one cold question: is the system becoming more predictable or less? A secret document like this, escaping the administration's core, doesn't just say there's a problem. It says the people in charge disagree so profoundly about the nature of the problem that they're now fighting with classified ammunition. Investors, allies, and adversaries see that, and they start quietly changing their models. If you are a central bank in Europe or Asia, you don't throw a tantrum. You don't hold a press conference. You simply adjust the share of your reserves that sits in dollars versus other assets. If you are a technology CEO planning a multi-billion-dollar factory in the United States, you don't go on television and attack the administration. You quietly ask your board whether it might be wise to stage that investment, to keep more flexibility, to build a parallel plant somewhere else, just in case. If you are a small democracy that depends on the USS security umbrella, you don't panic. But at the margins, you begin to consider alternative arrangements, more EU integration, a few more Chinese trade agreements, a little more hedging. The world doesn't move in one dramatic gesture. It moves by 1,000 small, rational decisions. And those small decisions, aggregated, are how empires fade. This leak will be one of those moments historians point back to and say, that was when the system started to be priced as a risk, not a guarantee. The third pillar is predictability. Here's something people often misunderstand. The world can handle bad news. What it cannot handle is unknowable news. If you tell investors taxes will go up by 3% next year, they don't like it, but they rewrite the spreadsheet and move on. If you tell them we genuinely have no idea who will be making decisions in 6 months, what constraints they'll respect, or whether orders will even be followed, they can't model that. So they do the only safe thing. They de-risk, they retreat, they delay, they hoard cash, they shorten time horizons. That's exactly what happens when you have a leak like this, pointing not just to policy disagreements, but to structural disagreements about power itself. Who has it? Who should have it? How far it can be stretched? And what to do when the system says no. The fissure widens. We also need to talk, frankly, about what this implies in terms of national security. If a document like this can leak, it tells us at least 3 disturbing things. First, that the access control systems for the administration's most sensitive internal analysis are weaker than they should be, either technically weak, procedurally weak, or culturally weak, in any case, a problem. Second, that somebody at the top is willing to weaponize that weakness. That's not a random phishing attack. That's a conscious choice by someone who knows exactly how sensitive this information is and decides, I'm going to use it anyway. Third, that foreign intelligence agencies don't have to do half the work they used to do. All they have to do is sit back and watch the internal conflicts escalate because every new factional struggle creates a new potential source of classified data. When I was running Microsoft, one of our worst nightmares wasn't that an external hacker would break in. It was that insiders with high-level access would go rogue. We built whole layers of audit, monitoring, compartmentalization, not because we distrusted our people, but because we understood human nature and institutional stress. When a government reaches the point where its most sensitive internal documents are being pulled into domestic political warfare, it is telling the world our internal controls have been subordinated to internal fear. And that's not just a domestic issue. That's a message to every adversary on earth. Push harder. They're distracted. Their attention is turned inward. Now, I don't want to turn this into abstract theory. Let's walk through what the next weeks look like inside a system like this. The leak hits. At first, the public conversation is chaotic. Who did it? Is it real? Is it doctored? Is it overblown? Partisans pick the passages that help them and ignore the rest. But inside the administration, the reaction is not chaotic, it is brutally specific and immediate. The hunt begins: who accessed the file? Whose login credentials show activity? Who was in the room when it was last discussed? Every badge swipe, every network access, every email, every text from the core group is suddenly subject to forensic scrutiny. People lawyer up. People clam up. People who were once collaborators become suspects. Long-standing tensions harden into factions. Some will side entirely with the political leadership. This is sabotage. We must crush it. Some will side with the civil service ethos. The analysis was real. The leak was the symptom, not the disease. Some will simply freeze, say as little as possible, and wait for the storm to pass. In that environment, honest information becomes radioactive. The incentive is not to tell the truth, the incentive is to survive. So the next internal assessment is shorter, blander, and more carefully worded. The scenarios are less explicit. The charts are less frightening. The conclusions are more vague. The problem is the risk has not changed. Only the documentation of the risk has changed. The system has become less honest with itself at exactly the moment it needed radical honesty. This is how pandemics spiral. This is how security vulnerabilities stay unpatched. This is how preventable financial crises become unprecedented shocks. The fissure widens. Let's step even further back. What did this document actually say? In essence, it said that the administration, as currently structured and behaving, faces a non-trivial risk of self-induced paralysis, not from a foreign attack, not from a natural disaster, but from its own internal contradictions. It reportedly outlined scenarios where key cabinet officials would refuse to implement directives they believe are unlawful. Agencies would delay or reinterpret orders to avoid legal exposure. Courts would issue conflicting injunctions faster than the administration can adjust policy. State governments would openly defy federal guidance, and the presidency itself could enter a contested zone where both authority and legitimacy are simultaneously in question. You don't have to agree with the author's politics to appreciate what they're modeling. They are describing a system where the executive branch, the agencies, the states, and the courts are no longer operating on shared assumptions about the rules. Once that happens, the system doesn't just slow down, it begins to break into parallel worlds. In one world, an order is binding. In another, it is unconstitutional and void. In one world, a directive is lawful. In another, it is evidence. And when you have a split reality like that, the question stops being what is the law and starts being which reality will the enforcement mechanisms choose to live in today. That is the point at which a rules-based system ceases to be rules-based. It becomes personality-based, power-based, and improvisational. That's how you transition very quickly from a stable environment to a volatile one. This is where people often say, well, Bill, surely this system is resilient. Haven't we been through crises before? Haven't we impeached presidents, survived scandals, seen constitutional tests, and somehow carried on? Yes, we have. But those earlier crises had two crucial differences. First, the people in charge of the system, whatever their politics, still agreed the system itself was more important than their immediate victory. They might push to the edge, but they backed away when the fabric itself began to tear. They saw the line and did not cross it. Second, the rest of the world was not standing by with a fully developed parallel architecture waiting to replace us. There was no alternative reserve currency ready for prime time, no Belt and Road scale economic network, no mature digital payment rails designed specifically to bypass US control. Today, both of those conditions are different. We have leadership factions that appear willing to treat institutions as disposable if they stand in the way of their survival. And we have external rivals and even longtime allies actively building and testing alternatives to our system, not because they hate us, but because they cannot afford to rely wholly on a system they no longer find predictable. So when a leak like this happens, the damage is multiplied. It's not just internal drama. It's a signal broadcast globally that says the United States is in the process of testing whether its institutional rules are real constraints or optional suggestions. For a country whose main competitive advantage is trust in its rules, that is an existentially dangerous experiment. The fissure widens. Let me add something else that doesn't get said enough. These kinds of leaks don't just affect abstract institutions. They affect the people doing the actual work. Think about the data scientists at CDC or the engineers at the Department of Energy hardening the grid, or the analysts at Cyber Command tracking threats 24/7. Their ability to do their jobs depends on vertical trust. I tell the truth upward, and I believe that truth will be acted on in good faith. When they watch a document like this, a sober internal systemic risk report get dragged into a political war, one of two things happens. Some say, good, at least the truth is out there now. Maybe this forces action. Others say, if that's what happens to people who surface uncomfortable realities, I'm not raising my hand. Over time, the second group grows, silence grows, caution grows, cynicism grows. The system stops producing unvarnished truth and begins producing strategically calibrated narratives. When that happens in a software company, your bug reports turn into marketing documents. When it happens in a health system, your case counts mysteriously flatten until suddenly they don't. When it happens in a government, your internal warnings become so sanitized that by the time a crisis hits, they're useless. The leak is a symptom of something, but the reaction to the leak can make the underlying disease worse, unless the leadership makes a radically different choice. So what would that choice look like? If I were advising any administration facing a leak like this, and I say this as someone who has spent his life in environments where brittle systems can kill people, I would put three principles on the table immediately. First, acknowledge the reality of the risk, not defensively, not with spin, not by attacking the authors or calling them disloyal or dismissing them as alarmists, but by saying, we asked for this analysis for a reason. Some of the scenarios are unacceptable. Some of the vulnerabilities are on us. We're going to fix them. Second, separate systemic critique from partisan warfare. Make it crystal clear, internally and externally, that there is a difference between leaking because you dislike a policy outcome and surfacing concerns because you see potential constitutional or operational failure. If everything is treated as treason, nothing gets fixed. Third, rebuild trust with transparency about process, not about personalities. You don't have to expose every internal disagreement to the world, but you do have to show that there is a functioning mechanism for resolving them without sabotage. That means clear procedures, independent review, and a visible willingness to pull back from the brink when the system itself is at stake. If you do those things, a leak like this can become a painful but constructive moment, the way a near miss in aviation leads to better procedures that save lives later. If you don't, then the leak doesn't close the fissure, it widens it. Now, I know how easy it is to treat all of this as theater. People say, well, it's Washington. There's always drama, there's always gossip, there's always someone claiming the sky is falling, but that's exactly why you have to zoom out. If this were just one leak in isolation, you might write it off. But it's not. It's arriving in a context, aggressive conflicts between the executive and the courts, public attacks on career civil servants and inspectors general, states openly defying federal directives, agencies contradicting each other in public, major legal questions about the scope of emergency powers, and increasingly open talk from all sides about weaponizing institutions. In other words, the system is already under stress. The feedback loops are already distorted. The trust environment's already degraded. Dropping a leaked systemic risk assessment into that environment is like dropping a lit match into a room that's been filling slowly with gas. The match is not the cause of the explosion, but it is the trigger. And when you understand systems, you stop asking, was the match justified? And you start asking, why was the room full of gas in the first place? Some people will ask, Bill, why do you care? You're a tech guy, you work on vaccines and climate and education. Why get involved in this? The answer is simple. Every one of those things depends on a predictable, rule-based system of governance. If you are trying to eradicate polio, you need stable governments that can coordinate campaigns across borders, maintain cold chains, protect health workers. If you are trying to decarbonize the energy system, you need regulatory predictability so that companies can make 30-year investments in the grid, in renewables, in new industrial processes. If you are trying to secure the digital infrastructure we all rely on, you need institutions that respect the rule of law, that don't casually compromise encryption, that don't treat security as something you can turn on and off for political convenience. All of that depends on something very boring and very profound, institutional integrity. Leaks like this are not just about one administration or one president. They are about whether the operating system underneath everything I just described is stable. And what I'm telling you is this, we've just seen the kind of leak that in other domains usually occurs shortly before a major failure, not because the leak causes the failure, but because leaks like this don't happen until the people closest to the system believe the failure is coming anyway. That's why the fissure matters. That's why the fact that it's widening matters. So what can be done? What can anyone do in the face of a system-level problem like this? If you're a citizen, the answer isn't glamorous, but it is powerful. First, stop treating politics like a reality show and start treating it like infrastructure. You don't pick a bridge because it's entertaining. You pick it because it can carry the load. Look for leaders at every level who talk about institutions with respect, who are willing to lose a short-term fight rather than permanently damage a long-term norm. Second, support and protect the people inside the system who are trying to tell the truth the right way through inspector general reports, through internal review boards, through lawful channels. If every attempt to raise concerns internally is ignored or punished, leaks become the only pressure valve people can see. Third, pay attention to governance, not just outcomes. It's easy to say, well, my side is winning right now, so whatever they have to do must be fine. But you will not always be in the winning camp. The rules you cheer being broken for your preferred leader can and will be used against you later. If you are an investor or a business leader, your role is different but aligned. Demand clarity about the rules. Push for transparency, not just in financial statements, but in regulatory processes. Don't treat institutional decay as a temporary arbitrage opportunity. Treat it as a long-term threat to your own business model. If you are inside government, you face the hardest choice of all. You have to decide whether you still believe the system can self-correct from within. If you do, then your job is to strengthen the internal channels to make sure that the next systemic risk assessment does not need to leak to be heard. If you don't, then you have to be honest about what that means, that you are living in a system that is running on borrowed time. Let me end with this. I've seen over and over again that human beings are capable of extraordinary course corrections when the reality becomes too stark to deny. We've turned back pandemics, we've pulled economies out of tailspins, we've rebuilt systems after catastrophic failures. But in every case, the turning point is the same. People stop pretending, they stop gaslighting each other, they stop treating honest analysis as betrayal. They look at the fissure, they admit it's real, and they decide collectively not to let it become a fracture. Right now, the United States is standing on exactly that kind of threshold. The secret document leak is not the beginning of the story. It's not the end of the story. It is the moment when the system showed us in black and white how fragile it has become, and when someone on the inside decided they no longer trusted the system to save itself. We can respond by attacking the messenger, ignoring the message, and accelerating the very failure the authors warned about. Or we can respond by doing something much harder, using this moment as a trigger to rebuild the internal trust, the external credibility, and the predictability that made the system worth betting on in the first place. The fissure has widened. That much is now undeniable. The only question that matters is whether we treat it as entertainment or as the final warning we needed before the core truly shatters.